Okay. So phonology and phonetics are both aspects of linguistics that look at sound, at the sound side of language. The difference between those is that phonetics is really about how we produce a sound, how we perceive a sound. So it's the sound as a physical event. And we ask ourselves, okay, which sounds are used in a language? And that's sort of as close as we get to individual language aspects in phonetics. In phonology, on the other hand, we always look within a language or within a variety. We ask ourselves, okay, what is the role, the function that a sound plays in the overall sound system of a language? So a B in German and a B in English may be realized phonetically in the same way, but they may play a completely different role in the linguistic system. Or we're going to see the S in English and the S in German, they play different roles in the overall sound system of the language. And so phonetics, we say it's about speech, about the physical event. Phonology is about language. It's the grammar of the sound of the language in a way. Okay. So, and here's an example. Like in both German and English, we have the S and the sh sound. However, in English, we say street and shrink, but we never say a word like strink. That doesn't exist. In German, however, if we translate the word street, this is, sorry, in German, it would be Straße, which is pronounced like this, right? And we don't have the pronunciation, at least not in the standard variety, and in many varieties we don't have Straße, we have Straße. So we see that even though German and English both have a S and a sh sound, they play a different role in the phonological system, in the sound system of the languages, in that the S in English can precede the TR sound. So we have street, but the sh cannot precede the TR sound. We cannot have str. In German, it's the other way around. So it is the S that is excluded in this position, and the sh is actually the only sound that can occur in this position. So you have the same sounds, but they play different roles in the different phonological systems. Okay. And of course, not only cross-linguistically, but also within the language, you have certain restrictions on where sounds can occur. For example, we can say slept, which is, of course, the English word slept in English, but we can't say sletp. So we can't change the order of the final two segments, or we can't change the order of the first two segments. We can't say ulsept. So there are certain restrictions on how sounds can be combined in a language. And these, as we saw, may differ from language to language. And this is what phonology is about. So the first thing we do in phonology is so-called phonotactics. So we try to get an inventory of the possible sound combinations in a given language. And in English, we see that English has huge syllables. English can have syllables that have like 3 consonants and then a vowel and then 3 more consonants. We typically have a vowel in an English syllable, and that vowel is surrounded by consonants, and there can be many consonants. We have languages that don't need a vowel in a syllable, like the famous Croatian island Krk, the k, r, k, Krk, and there's no vowel in this syllable, but it's still a syllable in this language. In English, at least stressed syllables always have a vowel. You sometimes have example like handle, so the l might be syllabic as well, but not stressed syllables. And stressed syllables in English, we always have a vowel. We have languages that have much simpler syllable structures, and my favorite example here is Hawaiian, which only has syllables that are just plain vowels or syllables consisting of one consonant and one vowel. Can never have consonant clusters in Hawaiian. Okay. Now, even though English allows for huge syllables, not every consonant cluster is possible. And we saw that earlier. For example, we can't say ulcept or we can't say sletp, right? And we see this also from Greek loanwords in English. So these words are pronounced in English as psychology, Gnostic, and mnemonic, whereas in German, we pronounce them as Psychologie, Gnostisch, and mnemonisch, right? So we do have the full consonant clusters at the beginning of the words, even though at least the ps and the mn do not occur in like more native and non-loan words in German. The gn does occur in non-loan words, like in things like gnome, or the kn in knolle, knecht, and so forth. Okay. So here in this position, German allows for different consonant clusters than English. Now, phonotactics is important for you as future teachers of English because it helps us understand certain accents. Now, we already know that pronunciation difficulties arise when you learn a foreign language if the foreign language uses a sound that does not occur in the languages that you already know. However, you also have problems if the new language uses a combination of sounds that does not occur in the languages that you know. Like we saw with the ps in English, or the Straße, if an English speaking person learns German, or the other way around, if a German speaking person learns English, then they have to be aware of the fact that it's street and not street. Okay. So how do people react to such combinations or such foreign elements that are difficult in pronunciation? So we have sound substitution. Of course, if we don't know a sound, we can substitute it with another one. Like for the TH sounds, the and the th, you often find German learners of English or German speakers of English, if they're not in a formal context, in a formal teaching context, they would substitute the THs with the, s, or the, th, and you find also environments where they would be substituted with the d and t. Another alternative, it would be to adjust the syllable structures, and you find that, for example, nicely for English words that are borrowed into a language like Hawaiian. And Hawaiian borrows many, many English words. And what we find there is a lot of substitution and a lot of syllable adjustment. Let me just give you one example. So for example, the English word drive is turned in Hawaiian. So it's borrowed into Hawaiian, but there it looks like so there it is. Okay, so the English would be, that is the English pronunciation. The Hawaiian pronunciation would be would be this. Okay, so how does that happen? So first of all, there is no d and no r in Hawaiian, so these sounds get substituted. The d is substituted with a k, the r is substituted with a l systematically in loan words. So here we have sound substitution. Then we know that Hawaiian only has consonant-vowel syllables, so there are no consonant clusters. So we need to adjust the syllable structures. So here a segment is inserted to make the syllable structure a consonant-vowel structure. And similarly here, you add an additional vowel because you cannot end a word in a consonant. And this is how, like, this English loanword is barely recognizable, but it's clearly just what happens when like when you try to, that's the closest you can get in the Hawaiian sound system to the English word drive. Okay. Good. And of course, closer to home, you find things happening also with like German speakers who learn English. They substitute the th sound. They may substitute, they may insert things. They may simplify sound structures if you have too complex syllable structures or foreign syllable structures. And also for English learners of German, they would substitute for the U sound or the Ö sound, so those front round vowels that they don't have in English. And yeah, good. So any questions on this phenomenon, the use of the use of phonotactics to actually understand foreign language accents, so that it's not just about sounds that are foreign, but also about sound combinations that may be absent. Let me mention one other important substitution, and that is final devoicing, which is sort of in German. There are no voiced oral stops or fricatives at the end of a word. So in German, the classical example is that the words Rad and Rad are both pronounced exactly the same way, namely as Rad. In English, we do have, there are voiced oral stops and fricatives at the end of a word. And this is something that is very difficult for German learners of English. So the difference between bid and bit, right? So that it's really, in one case, you really have bid, and in the other case, you have bit. So German learners of English tend to pronounce these two words the same, right? And that is, of course, not what should happen. It's just like, yeah, exactly. And that is in German, we have final devoicing, and German speakers are not aware that they do final devoicing, but they do it automatically. And this is why it's very hard for them to not do it when, or hard for us, I include myself, to not do final devoicing in other languages. Final devoicing is not just happening in German. I think in Russian, you also have final devoicing slightly differently, but more or less the same. So that is a difficulty that speakers with different linguistic backgrounds may have when learning English. Okay. Good. Any questions? No? Okay. Good. Now, in the links-based videos, Lieberman talked about the fact that we never utter the same sounds. Even if we say the same word, we never utter the same word identically, exactly identically twice. So it's always different. The movements are never fully identical, but not all variation actually is harmful, and not all variation gets noticed. So even though when we record things, we can exactly record the sound signal, but what we perceive is not a continuous thing. What we perceive is categorical. Actually, we perceive sounds categorically in two senses. So first of all, we have the impression that the sound signal comes in segments, one segment after the other. This impression that people have is what makes an alphabetic script possible. And this seems to be the way we actually perceive sounds. Sound sequences are perceived as sequences of individual segments, even though the segments really are actually, from the point of view of the movement, they are they sort of co-occur. It's like when you type on your keyboard and you can type with 10 fingers, then you hit, like hitting the right keys. That's like the categorical perception of letters coming one after the other, like sound segments coming one after the other. But actually the movements that you do, they are not like that. So when you press one key, when you hit one key, you already anticipate with your movement the next key that you're going to hit, and some of your hand is still in the position from the last key that you hit. And the same is true for what happens in our pronunciation. Nonetheless, our perception is like we were looking at the piece of paper that you wrote when you type with your typewriter. So this is one thing. There's one sense of categorical. The other sense of categorical is that an individual segment can have different forms and shapes. Like I can say a t in a more with more air leaving the mouth, with less air leaving the mouth, and so forth. So there's a lot of variation there. And this kind of variation is also not perceived, at least not perceived for the purpose of trying to understand what you're saying. So when you play, like there is actually a continuum between d and t, a continuum of like voicing. And so when does it, if you say da and ta, there's a continuum in where the vocal folds start to vibrate to produce the vowel. Now, technically, you can, of course, you can have control over when you start the vibration of the vocal folds, when the voicing starts, the voice onset time. And you can change that in very, very small steps, but what language users will perceive is categorical. There is a cutoff point where, say, up to that point, they will recognize the sound as a d sound, and from a certain point on, they will recognize it as a t sound. So in that sense, also our perception is categorical and not continuous, even though the sound signal is a continuous signal. Okay. Now, in phonology, we are interested in these boxes, into what is the range of sounds that are perceived as a t sound. So in which sense is a t sound a cognitive category in our minds? And what are the concrete phonetic realizations that fall into this category, and which types of realizations do we find in which environment? So that is what we do in phonology. Okay, And these are some examples also like given from the in the Lieberman video. So you may remember that the top in the t in top, that this is an aspirated t. In stop, it's non-aspirated. In hidden, you can have the non-aspirated one, you can have the flap, or you can just have a glottal stop. So this would be a flap, and this is the glottal stop. You can say kitten, kitten, you can say kitten, kitten, you can say kitten with a flap, or you can say kitten, kitten, where you don't have any, where you don't do anything with the tongue and you just have a glottal stop. Similarly, when you have the word cut, the word cut can be produced with an ordinary t. It can be produced with a unreleased t. So this is you close the airstream, but you don't open it. You don't have this this release of the closure. You just say cut, cut, but not cut, cut. So just say cut. Okay. And in this form, you can also just have the glottal stop. You can say cut, cut. And you find that in many colloquial varieties of British English, at least. Okay, good. So we see there is a lot of variation in how we produce this sound, but for all of them, it is perceived by the competent users of the language as a realization of a t sound. Somehow they have this idea, this concept, this cognitive concept of a t in their minds, and we find these various realizations. Okay. Now, in order to identify which sounds are, which sort of concrete sounds belong to which concept, and how many different concepts we have in a language, we have the method of working with minimal pairs. And so this is, we use two sequences of sounds, and under certain conditions, they constitute a minimal pair. Okay. Now, first of all, what is a sequence of a minimal pair? A minimal pair is two sequences of sound that differ only in one segment, but that are interpreted as two distinct words of the language. So an example is book and look. If I do the transcription, or the transcription, so this is book, and this is look. And you can see both words have three segments. The first, the second and the third segments are the same. They only differ with respect to the first segment. They have a b in the first word and a l in the second word. And these are actually two distinct words. So this shows to me that the b in book and the l in look are different enough for users of the language to be used to mark a difference in words. Okay, so the b and the l are distinct, cognitively distinct sounds in the English language. We can do the same, for example, for b and p. We can have the words, the name or the word bill and the word pill. Similarly, also for vowels, the E and the I. So there is a difference between beat and bit. Okay, so the I difference is used in English as well. Now on this slide, you see some examples of pairs of sounds that are not minimal pairs. So let me just go through two or three of them. So play and flay, play and flay. They're not a minimal pair because slay is not a word of the English language, right? So this is why this is not a minimal pair. This is not a word. If I have play, sorry, play and play, play and play, you see in the transcription that the L in the first realization is a light L, so just L, and the one in the second realization is the dark L, so the L, but this is no difference. It's still the word play, right? Whether I produce it with a light L or dark L, so play or play doesn't really matter. It's the same word. So this is why this is not a minimal pair. But the sound sequences differ in one segment. What about side and side? There we have the other case. So even though these are two words, they're pronounced exactly the same way. And if there's no difference in the pronunciation, then there's no minimal pair. This doesn't tell us anything about the sound system of the English language. It's just one sequence of sounds that has two meanings, and that's also something that is possible. Okay. And finally, pet and sad. There you see pet and sad. So they are like every single segment is different. It's just that German learners of English may not be able to distinguish or may not systematically distinguish between the e in pet and the e in sad, which is a bit more open. And because of the final devoicing, they may not distinguish between the voiceless t in pet and the voiced d in sad. Okay. So why do we think that something like the different realizations of a p sound, so the aspirated or the t sound, the aspirated t, the unreleased t, the t that is preceded by a glottal stop or just the glottal stop, why do we think that all these are somehow instances of the same underlying cognitive sound category? And we think there is some evidence for that, and the evidence is that, first of all, these are perceived as one category by the native speakers. And I mentioned last week that when you do these perception experiments, when you alternate a sound, and then there is some cutoff point up to which speakers say it's a b sound, and from which on they say it's a p sound, or the other way around, or similarly with other sounds. And another aspect is that the realization is predictable. So I know exactly when I have a t sound, this underlying concept of a t sound, and I know where in a word the t sound occurs, I can then predict which version of the t sound will occur. So the aspirated one will only occur at the beginning of a syllable. And the one preceded with a glottal stop, or the unreleased one, will only occur at the end of a syllable. Similarly, the one with a glottal stop will only occur at the end of a syllable, and the flapping of the t, for example, will only occur between two vowels. So there's a predictable realization alternatives. And finally, we find, that's what I find but the strongest evidence is that when you look at slips of the tongue, you get the different realizations as well. So when you have the word paddle and you mispronounce it as dabble, then we see that the p in paddle is aspirated, so you get paddle, but the p in dabble is not aspirated. So this is, I think, the best evidence for showing that actually we have some underlying representation where the p is just represented as a p, as the abstract cognitive category p, and then the concrete realization decision will happen basically after this slip of the tongue had happened in our brain or in our production process. So we start with that underlying representation. We have the slip of the tongue, and then this revised representation is then sent off to the articulatory organs, and that is where the particular choice of the choice of the particular realizations of the phonemes will happen. And that is how we can account for the fact that when you mispronounce paddle as dabble, you have an aspiration in paddle, but not in dabble. Right? So I think there is evidence for this cognitive category of a sound. So the sound as that we have this like linguistic sound system. The sound system is part of our grammar of the language. And this is, and the sound system consists of these abstract categories plus the rules. And the, and so this is why it makes sense to say, okay, we have an abstract representation, and we also get then a concrete realization, but it's not just the concrete realization. Okay. Questions on that? No. Okay. This is the terminology that is used. So we call this abstract sound category. We call it the phoneme. And a phoneme is the smallest unit of the language that marks a difference in meaning. And to find out the phonemes, we use this technique of the minimal pairs, because the minimal pairs help us identify which segments are actually used to mark different words. So which segments are used in the language to mark differences in meaning. And we saw the light and the dark L. This contrast is not used in English, but the contrast between B and P, or in our example, F and R, that is used in the English language to mark a contrast in meaning. The concrete realizations of the phoneme are called the allophones of the phoneme. So you're always an allophone of something. And the phoneme is written in slashes, and the allophones are just like our phones in general, our sounds in general. They're written in square brackets. Okay. So we have, when we work with the technique of minimal pairs, we use it to identify the phonemes in a language. And when we look at different sounds, we use this technique of minimal pairs to identify whether these two sounds are allophones of the same or of different phonemes. Okay, how do we do that? So we have three kinds of distributional possibilities for sounds. And the first one is the complementary distribution. It's two phones, so two distinct sound segments that never occur in the same environment are in complementary distribution. So in this case, I cannot find a minimal pair because these sounds don't occur in the same environments. So for example, the unreleased P and the aspirated P, they don't occur in the same environment. I have a word like pill with an aspiration. So where I have the aspirated P, but I cannot have a word like this. So this is not a word of the English language. Ill, that doesn't exist in English. So these two sounds, the aspirated P and the unreleased P, never occur in the same environments. Or the other way around, if I have the word stop, for example, that can be pronounced with the unreleased P, but I cannot have the pronunciation stop, stop. That doesn't really exist in English. So they don't occur in the same environments. It's impossible to find a minimal pair. And then we say, okay, then they must be allophones of the same phoneme, namely the P sound. Here in this case, we then conclude that P and p and up are allophones of p. Okay. Another distribution is the contrastive distribution. And the contrastive distribution is exactly when I do find a minimal pair. So two phones that cannot be exchanged without changing the meaning of a sound combination are in contrastive distribution. And this is exactly the situation that characterizes a minimal pair. And so we then say, if two phones are in contrastive distribution, they belong to different phonemes. They are allophones of different phonemes, right? So for example, the contrast that we just had between f and r. So we do have a minimal pair like fun versus run, which we transcribed as fun versus run. And then we saw these are two distinct words. And we then conclude from that th and r are allophones of distinct phonemes. Good. And so, yeah. And then the third type of distribution is free variation. If two phones, distinct sound segments, can be freely exchanged in an environment without a change in meaning, then these two phones stand in free variation. So free variation means it doesn't matter which of the sounds I'm using, I'm still just uttering the same word, or the result is perceived as being the same word by competent users of the language. And we say that the two phones that are in free variation are allophones of the same phoneme. Now, we've already seen an instance of that. Do you remember which example we had where we were talking about an allophone, of two phones being in free variation? So we had the example, the clear and the dark L. So in English, this is the L versus the dark L is here. And these are in free variation, like we had the example of play and play. And so for many, like I think all speakers of the English language have a dark L, but some speakers also have the clear L, and the clear L can occur before vowels. So at the beginning of a syllable, you can get a clear L. At the end of a syllable, I think all speakers have a dark L, but all speakers can also have a dark L at the beginning of a syllable. So there's no difference there, no contrast between clear and dark L. So if two sounds are in complementary distribution or contrastive distribution, in complementary distribution or in free variation, then they are instances of the same phoneme. If they are in contrastive distribution, so if I can actually build a minimal pair, then they are instances of distinct phonemes. And this technique of finding the phoneme inventory is very useful because it helps us get down to like the minimal amount of sound categories that native speakers have for their language. And usually that is a very good starting point if you want to come up with a good alphabet for a writing system for a language, or also something that you can take as basis for your transliteration in a dictionary, for example. There are some quirks with that. There's a final point, namely that the two sounds that you identify, if you categorize them as instances of the same phoneme, they should also be phonetically similar. So if two phones are candidates for being allophones of the same phoneme, they must be phonetically similar. And this condition is there for the to cover cases like the h and the ng. The h and the ng sound, they are actually such that you can never have a minimal pair with the h and the ng sound. So they never stand in free variation, but they also never stand in contrastive distribution. Why is that? It's because the h sound, just think of words with h that have a h in it. So you can see that the h sound is in words like hotel and house and so forth. So the h sound only occurs at the beginning of syllables, and the ng sound, if you think of words that have the ng sound in it, like sing and beginning and so forth, you see that this sound only occurs at the end of a syllable and nowhere else. This means that they are in complementary distribution. So they should be, they are candidates for being allophones of the same phoneme. However, they are not because they are not phonetically similar. So if you look at the phonetic characterization of the h sound and the ng sound, so what would be the h sound is so it is a consonant, it is an oral consonant. H is voiceless. And where is it formed? It's formed at the back. Where exactly at the back? We can look here. It is a glottal, a voiceless glottal consonant. Fricative, sorry, fricative. Voiceless glottal fricative. The ng sound is also oral, but is voiced. It's not glottal, but if you look at this here, it is a velar sound, and it's not a fricative, but it is a nasal stop. Sorry, excuse me. It's a nasal voiced velar stop. Okay, so you can see here that these two sounds have nothing in common. One is oral, one is nasal. So they're all pulmonic, that's the thing. They're all pulmonic, but that's about it. One is oral, one is nasal, one is voiceless, one is voiced, one is glottal, one is velar, one is a fricative, and one is a stop. So they are phonetically very dissimilar, and for that reason, we don't think, and us like native speakers or competent users of the language do not perceive them as being part of the same cognitive category. Let's then look at this idea of the predictable variation. We said that the allophones that are instances of the same phoneme vary in a predictable way. So if I know the environment, I know which allophone to use. And for example, if I have the words blue, gleam, sleep, flog, and leave, I always have a voiced L. But if I have the words flow, clap, clear, and play, I always have a voiceless L in English. So there's a little zero below the L here on the slide. So the L in blue is voiced. The L in plaw is voiceless. So the L, the voiced L and the voiceless L, they stand actually in complementary distribution and in the following ways that we have the L after B, G, S, F, and L, but we have the voiceless L realization after P and K. Okay, so it seems that the default would be the voiced realization, which also is in line with our intuitions that the L is a voiced sound. But we do find the voiceless realization after P and K. So we can then say L is realized as its voiceless allophone when following P or K. So we can predict under in which environments we find the voiceless realization. And when we look at that, we can actually generalize this further. We can say actually the L, we can generalize this. We can say L is realized as its voiceless allophone when following a voiceless stop. And so it's not just a voiceless sound, because we also find slip and flog, where we have a voiceless first element, but it's not a stop, it's a voiceless fricative, and then we still get the voiced L sound in English. Okay. So that is a allophonic rule, a rule that determines or that helps us describe when to use which realization of the phoneme. Okay, and we get allophonic rules like that. So for L, we have a voiced and a voiceless allophone. And we say if L is preceded by a voiceless stop, choose the voiceless allophone, else choose the voiced allophone. And we already saw examples for the P sound. There we can say things like the allophonic rules for the phoneme P. We've got several allophones. We've got an aspirated one, an unreleased one, a plain one. And then we can say, okay, if it occurs at the beginning of a syllable, choose the aspirated allophone. Then we can say if it, for example, if it occurs, so there we say always choose the aspirated, always choose the aspirated allophone if it occurs at the end of a syllable. You may choose the unreleased one, but you cannot choose the aspirated, and so forth. So that is how you get the allophonic rules. So you first set up the inventory of the phonemes, and by doing that, you already collect the different allophones, and then you describe the allophonic rules for these for the choice of the allophones. And that's why this is so important. And that's also these. Even if you have like a language like Spanish, where the orthography is very phonemic, so basically the Spanish orthography indicates to you how you would pronounce a word, but it is phonemic, so it doesn't give you all the variation. So if you have the spelling of a Spanish word, and then you still need to know the allophonic rules of Spanish in order to be able to pronounce the word. However, the pronunciation is predictable, but only if you know the rules. So for example, that if you have something written with a the contrast between b and v is disappears in Spanish at the beginning of a word, so there's always b, so it's Valencia. Or another example would be that sometimes you have a d sound, sometimes you have a the sound, but it's always spelled with a d, because in Spanish, the is just an allophone of the d sound. So if you have a d, so the phoneme d appearing between two vowels, then it is turned into a fricative. Right? And that is something that you have to teach the pupils, because the Spanish speakers, they do that anyways. But if you're learned as a foreign language, then you have to be taught that property. Now, luckily, as always with language, things are not unsystematic. It's not just a random long list of rules, but there is system to the rules. And that's what we call phonological generalizations. So we already saw that here. So we don't really have to learn, oh, it's after p and k and not after b, g, s, f, l, or at the beginning of a word, but we can say actually this devoicing of the l happens after a voiceless stop. So that's already generalization. And then we can even go further in this generalization because we find that this does not only happen with liquids, so with the so it not only happens, with the l sound, but it actually also happens with the r sound. So the l and the r have the same devoicing rule in English. So it's also brew but praw, green but creep. Right? So the r in creep is voiceless, but the r in green is voiced. So r and l behave the same with respect to the devoicing. And it's not just the r and the l, it's also the glides. It's also the y and the w. So we have beauty with a voiced y, but putrid with a voiceless y. It's Gwen, but quick, right? So you see, actually, it is 4 sounds, namely the liquids and the glides of the English language, that behave exactly the same. They have this devoicing in exactly the same environments, namely when they follow a voiceless sound, a voiceless stop. Okay. Just like also final devoicing in German, it's not just final devoicing of the d, it's actually final devoicing of all the stops and the fricatives. So all the oral stops and the fricatives. So it's the l, the r, the y, and the w, the liquids and the glides. And if you go to the IPA chart, you find them actually listed here as approximant. So it's the r and the l, they're both approximants. The y is an approximant, and the w is also, it's a voiced labial velar approximant, the w. So it's basically all the approximants are undergo devoicing. And that's cool. So you don't need to learn like very tiny rules, but you typically have more general rules because language is very systematic. Then let's just do the second set of example or of exercises from the phonetics, from the phonology part of last semester's exam. And let's do that. So look at sentence S4. Find occurrences of 2 different allophones of p in the sentence. Provide the complete words in which they occur. And then for each allophone, state the allophonic rule responsible for the choice of this allophone. Okay, let's see. That is a sentence. Let's find different allophones of the p sound. So let's just underline when we have a p. We've got entrepreneurs, reputation, playground, appeal, development, possible. Okay, so those are the occurrences of the p. We can next ask ourselves, how are they pronounced? Now we already know a number of things about the p. So we can basically look for things that we know about, right? So we know that the p, when it's at the beginning of a word, is aspirated. Okay, let's look at occurrences of the p when at the beginning of the word. Do we find such things? Yeah, we actually do find things. We find possible. So I double check, is it aspirated in the word possible? Possible. So possible, that is aspirated. So I found an instance of an aspirated p. And then do I find other things? Are developments. That's not at the beginning of a word. That's at the end of a syllable. Development development, okay, I have the ordinary, the plain P there. Or maybe I even have the unreleased one. If I say, look at my lips, development. I don't say development, I say development. So I don't open the mouth between the P and the M. So this means the P is unreleased. So this gives me this one. Okay. Appeal is aspirated, and entrepreneur is also aspirated. Playground is aspirated. Okay, so these are the two allophones of the P sound that I have in my sentence. Okay, so then I write as an answer to question to question 4. I have the aspirated real allophone in possible. So the first segment in the word possible. And again, you don't have to know the IPA symbol. If you tell me it's the first segment in the word possible, then I have everything I need to know. We have the unreleased, allophone, you can say the P sound in the word development. And then you can give me the rule of the aspirated of P must and can only appear at the very beginning of a syllable, and the unreleased, and that's it, right? So you see how you would work with such an example or such a question. You would just look for all occurrences of this phoneme and then ask yourselves, okay, what are the different realizations? And then you identify them and you give a characterization. If you think there's only one allophone, then you just do that one, and then you at least get half the points for the task. Then let's look at the phonological processes. Look at sentence S6. Find examples in the sentence in which the following phonological processes can occur in pronunciation. The same word might illustrate more than one process. And so this is our example sentence. But the reality is that with climate change, we need to start walking away from that. And I ask for progressive assimilation. Okay, where is there? So I ask for progressive assimilation for partition and deletion. Okay, let's think about that. Do you find an instance of any of these three phenomena in this example? Progressive assimilation, partition, or deletion? Progressive assimilation, you remember, it's things are becoming closer to one another, more similar to one another, and progressive means that the property spreads forward. And so one example is what we have already seen. You'll look at the word climate change. Remember cl? What have we just talked about, like the rule for the approximants? We see that the l in climate change is pronounced as a voiceless l. That's right. Here we have climate change. So the voicelessness of the k spreads forward and affects the l. So we have a progressive assimilation of voicing in this example. So let me just use another slide. So for 5a, we have climate, and there we have a progressive assimilation of voicing. So the all is realized as its voiceless allophone. And you see this, the idea that the allophonic rules are not arbitrary. So first of all, they come in classes, but they're also not arbitrary. They are motivated through the articulatory processes. So what is easier for us to articulate, and this is, I think, also what you meant with things happen automatically, because that is the way we have like optimized in a particular language the pronunciation of the sounds. So here, as we said, this is realized as climate. Okay, fortition. Fortition is a strengthening. And the prime example of strengthening that we talked about is aspiration. Do we find instances of aspiration here? But the reality is that with climate change, we need to start walking away from that. So we find aspiration with voiceless stops, so with a p, t, and k. So the t in start is not aspirated because there's the s before. Start, not aspirated. But if I say climate change, actually here we also get the aspiration. So the k in climate is also aspirated. So not only is the l devoiced, but that's also an example where we have a fortition on the k. So in 5b, it's also the word climate. And there we have aspiration of the k. So here actually we have this pronunciation. So it could, if we want to add this here as well. But again, you don't need to give me any transcription because it's enough if you characterize what's happening. And finally, we are asked for deletion, or it's probably the t. I would assume that you get the pronunciation need to start. Sorry. Yep. Exactly. So that the t here is deleted. You could also, but the realities. So you could also here delete the sound. The reality is. You could also get reality, right? You could delete the is sound here, right? So exactly, I think what you get here is either a total assimilation, that the d and the t get totally assimilated. You need a start, or you can say that actually you have the t deletion. Similarly here, it's the deletion of the that can happen. Thank you. Good, so 5c, need to, is pronounced as need to. And there you could then say that the t, or the initial of the word to, is deleted. Another example is what we find with the word is, when we have a realization as a clitic, and then the word is just reduced to the z form. So here we have the pronunciation. And as we saw, I think, in the text and also like maybe in the video, these function words in the English language, they tend to be phonologically very much reduced, and actually to the extent that they may even lose segments. So you see that with the preposition to here, and Sorry, it's not the preposition, it's the infinitival marker to, which we've learned is an auxiliary. The infinitival marker to is reduced, or also the auxiliary verb be in the form is can be reduced. Let's then see if we find other phonological processes in the text. So what other phonological processes do we have? We have lenition. Do you have an instance of a lenition? Maybe we can look at this or at the overall text. Do you remember an example of a lenition that we had in the a weakening that was mentioned in the video? And then you can try to find such an example in the text. So the typical cases of weakening are things like when vowels become schwa, so like in unstressed syllables. You remember the example that we had earlier with Canada and Canadian. So we're in Canada, so the second vowel is a schwa, is an e, but in Canadian, when it's stressed, it's actually even a diphthong, right? So we have this the weakening of vowels, the lenition of vowels in unstressed syllables. Let's see if we find an example of that in this text. Now, with all the function words, of course, you could say the word into is pronounced as into. So here we have into is normally pronounced as inter. But underlyingly, it might actually be into, and this is realized as inter. So what we get here is a lenition or weakening, because a vowel is produced as a schwa. We also find lenition with the flapping of the t sound, for example, the flapping of the t sound between vowels. And in this example text, which is all about lakes and water, of course, in the case of the word water, sorry, put it in red. The same in water there. For water, we have underlyingly, it's something like that. But the realization can be water. Sorry. And there we find a weakening of the t sound, and that is a flapping. So flapping of t is an instance of a lenition. So we had lenition, fortition, progressive assimilation, and deletion. So we need regressive assimilation and epenthesis and metathesis. So those are the processes that we still need. Maybe we can easily find an example of a regressive assimilation. A regressive assimilation is that a property of a segment spreads backwards, right? Like in krank, where the ng is velarized, the n is pronounced as a velar sound because it is followed by a velar sound. So we have a regressive assimilation of the place of articulation. So maybe we find something like that. In Glasgow, exactly, that is exactly the same instance. That is the regressive assimilation of the place of articulation. So the velar g spreads the velar place of articulation backwards, and that's why we don't get in Glasgow, but in Glasgow. Exactly. Exactly. So we can look for an example like that. Or another example that I think was given in the video was the nasalization, so that the vowel in the word hand is slightly nasalized. And remember, for the n, we lower the velum. And in English, you start lowering the velum relatively early. So this is why you don't get, in German we say Hand, and the R in Hand is not nasalized, but the e in hand in English is slightly nasalized. Okay, so let's just look for these two things. So if the word landscape, I actually can have a nasalization here. So the e in landscape is slightly nasalized. Landscape, good. And you had the in Glasgow example. So we need something where we have for example, the preposition in is always nice because it nicely assimilates. If we have in water, in water, in water, in water, I don't know whether people would say in water here. Maybe that's not the best example. But very similar is, of course, the simple ing thing, right? So in swimming pools, for example, here the n is velarized here. Okay, great. So we did have examples for most of the phonological processes. We also have the, let me just put that here, that this is regressive assimilation of nasality. Good. Okay, so thank you very much